The air in the penthouse was a silent, sterile testament to wealth. It was 3 a.m., a dead hour suspended between the memory of yesterday's hustle and the promise of tomorrow's. From his vantage point 57 floors above the sleeping city, Nico the ghost. Volkov watched the distant, glittering veins of traffic. The city was a beast he had once tamed, a sprawling kingdom whose every dark alley and gilded tower had paid him tribute. For the last 7 years, however, he had been at peace with it, a retired king content to watch from his castle. But tonight, that peace was shattered by a single, infuriating act of disrespect. His phone vibrated on the marble countertop, a low hum against the silence. He didn't need to look at the caller ID. Only one person would call him at this hour. "Talk to me, Dmitri," Nico said, his voice a low gravel that seemed to absorb the light in the room. "It's gone, boss." Dmitri's voice was flat, professional, but laced with an undercurrent of disbelief. "The Cullinan, gone from the private garage." Nico closed his eyes. It wasn't about the car, not really. The custom-built Rolls-Royce, a machine of obsidian paint and whisper-quiet power, was a $750,000 toy. He could replace it with a phone call. It was about the principle. It was about the sanctuary. His private garage was a fortress, protected by layers of security that Dmitri himself had designed. For someone to penetrate it, to lay hands on his property, was a message. It was a challenge. Or worse, it was a sign that the city had forgotten who he was. "Police?" Nico asked, though he already knew the answer. "No, this is not for them. This is family business." "Good," Nico said. He walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, his bare feet silent on the cold Italian marble. At 42 years old, Nico Volkov was a monument of a man. Standing 6'4", he was 250 pounds of disciplined muscle, honed by a life that demanded physical dominance. His tailored Brioni suit hung in the closet, but even in simple gray sweatpants and a black t-shirt, his power was palpable. It radiated from him, a physical presence that bent the air around him. His history was written on his skin. On the right side of his thick neck, the Archangel Michael was caught in the eternal act of slaying a demon, the intricate ink a masterpiece of shadow and light. Wrapping around to the left side, the Cyrillic words "Spasi I Sochrani," save and protect, were etched in a severe, old-world script. It was a prayer his mother had taught him, a plea for divine intervention in a life that had often courted the demonic. His hands, large and calloused, were a roadmap of his philosophy. The knuckles on his right hand spelled iron, the left, will. He had ruled the entire East Coast narcotics and logistics pipeline for 15 brutal years with those two principles. They called him the Ghost, because rivals and traitors didn't just get beaten or buried, they vanished. One day they were a problem, the next they were a rumor, a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones. But that life was over. It had ended 7 years ago, on the day he buried his 6-year-old daughter, Anya. He had watched leukemia do what no army of men, no federal task force, no rival family ever could. It had brought him to his knees. He had poured his entire empire, hundreds of millions of dollars, into fighting it. He flew in specialists from across the globe, funded experimental treatments, threatened, bribed, and begged. But it was a foe his power could not touch. When he held her tiny, cold hand for the last time, he understood the hollowness of his crown. The ghost died with his daughter. Nico Volkov was who remained. He had dismantled his own organization with the same ruthless efficiency he had used to build it, ensuring a peaceful transition of power, preventing a bloody vacuum. He had laundered his soul, if not his money, and built a legitimate empire of logistics and real estate worth over $500 million. And now, someone had stolen his car. Pull the logs from every camera within a 10-block radius. I want every angle. Use the old network. Wake up anyone you have to. I don't care what time it is, Nico commanded. I want to know who had the audacity to breathe on my property, and I want them found before the sun comes up. Already happening, Dmitri confirmed. I'll be at your location in 10. Nico disconnected and stood before the window. The reflection staring back at him was a man he had tried to bury. The heavy, 18-karat gold Byzantine chain around his neck seemed to glitter with a predatory light. The custom signet ring on his pinky, a black onyx wolf's head, felt heavier than it had in years. He saw the coldness in his own eyes, an arctic stillness that had frozen the blood of lesser men. He had built a new life, a quiet life, but the foundation was forged in violence. And tonight, the cracks were showing. Someone had forgotten the ghost was real. He was about to remind them. Subscribe now, because what happens next proves that even the hardest men can be broken open by the most unexpected things. Comment where you're watching from. This story will remind you that true strength isn't about power, but protection. Dmitri arrived not in 10 minutes, but in 8. He was a block of granite in a human suit, his loyalty to Nico absolute and unquestioning. He had been Nico's right hand in the old life, and now he was the head of his legitimate security. The distinction was purely semantic. They were amateurs, Dmitri said, holding up a tablet. They bypassed the first 2 gate sensors, but tripped a silent proximity alarm on the vehicle itself. The car has been broadcasting its location every 30 seconds since it left the garage. They didn't know about the secondary tracker, a military-grade GPS unit embedded in the chassis. Nico looked at the screen. A single red dot blinked patiently on a map of the city's industrial wasteland, a forgotten part of the docks riddled with abandoned warehouses and crumbling piers. A place where things and people went to disappear. They're not moving, Nico observed. Been stationary for the last 90 minutes, Dmitri confirmed. They drove it straight there and parked. Doesn't smell like professionals. Pros would have swept for a tracker or parked it in a shielded container by now. Amateurs are more dangerous. They're unpredictable, Nico mused, his mind sifting through possibilities. A joyride? A desperate junkie looking for something to fence? Or was this a test? A new player in the city trying to measure his response? He slipped on a pair of polished black Tom Ford boots and grabbed a heavy, cashmere overcoat. The platinum Audemars Piguet on his wrist caught the light as he moved. Just you and me? Dmitri asked. Just you and me, Nico confirmed. No noise, no sirens. I'm handling this personally. The drive to the docks was silent. Dmitri navigated the empty streets with practiced ease in a blacked-out Mercedes S-Class that was just as customized as the Cullinan, albeit with more of an emphasis on armor plating than luxury. Nico stared out the window, the city lights blurring into streaks of neon. He felt the old instincts stirring, the cold, calculating part of his brain that had been dormant for 7 years waking up. He felt the familiar thrum of controlled rage, a focused energy that had leveled his enemies. He had built his peace on the ashes of his old life, and he would defend that peace with the same fire he had once used to conquer. They found the Cullinan parked in a desolate alley, tucked between 2 derelict brick warehouses. Its perfect obsidian finish was muted by the darkness, but it was unmistakable. It looked like a panther hiding in the shadows, out of place and yet completely dominant. Stay with the car, Nico instructed Dmitri. Keep it running. No one comes in or out of this alley until I say so. Dmitri simply nodded, his hand resting casually near the inside of his jacket. Nico stepped out of the Mercedes, his expensive boots crunching softly on broken glass and gravel. The air was cold and damp, smelling of salt, decay, and river water. There were no lights in the alley, save for the distant, jaundiced glow of a street lamp at the far end. He approached the Rolls-Royce from the driver's side, his movements silent and fluid, a predator stalking its prey. His reflection was a distorted specter in the tinted window. He saw the imposing figure, the severe lines of his face, the tattoos snaking up his neck. He looked like the monster from the stories they used to tell about him. He expected a confrontation. He was ready for it. His mind was a cold ledger, calculating angles of attack, potential threats, the precise application of force required to end this situation. He reached for the handle, his tattooed fingers curling around the cold chrome. He half expected it to be locked, for a figure to burst out of the darkness. But the door was unlocked. It opened with a soft, expensive sigh, and the rage that had been a roaring furnace in his chest for the last 3 hours instantly vanished, extinguished by a sight so unexpected, so profoundly disarming, that it knocked the air from his lungs. There was no joyrider, no gangster, no threat. Huddled in the cavernous back seat, wrapped in a thin, worn-out blanket, was a young woman. She couldn't have been more than 24, her face pale and gaunt with exhaustion and fear. Her eyes, wide and terrified, locked onto his, and cradled in her arms, sleeping soundly against her chest, was a newborn baby. So small it looked like it could fit in the palms of his hands. The interior of the $700,000 car smelled faintly of baby powder and desperation. The woman flinched, pulling the baby closer, a small protective motion that screamed of a mother's instinct. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please don't hurt us. It was unlocked. It was so cold." Nico stood frozen, the cold alley air swirling into the warm, leather-scented cabin. His mind, which seconds ago had been a weapon, was now a hollow chamber of echoes. The sight of the child, so fragile and new, ripped open a wound in his soul he thought had long since scarred over. He saw Anya. He saw her in the hospital bed, her small body overwhelmed by an enemy he couldn't fight. He remembered the desperate, primal need to protect her, to shield her from all the world's cold and pain, a need he had failed to fulfill. His towering presence, his expensive clothes, the menace he had cultivated his entire life, all of it felt like a sick joke in the face of this raw, quiet desperation. The woman was looking at him not as a car owner, but as a potential monster, a final, terrible threat in a life that had clearly been full of them. And in her eyes, he saw a reflection of the man he used to be, the man he never wanted to be again. He slowly, deliberately, took a step back, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. The iron will tattooed on his knuckles seemed to mock him. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, and the gravel in his voice was gone, replaced by a softness he hadn't used in 7 years. It was the voice he had used for Anya's bedtime stories. "You're safe." If this story is proving that the most powerful people are the ones who choose to protect the powerless, hit that like button right now and share it with someone who needs to see it. Now back to the story. The woman, whose name he would learn was Lena, didn't believe him. Her terror was a living thing in the small space, coiling around them both. She clutched her baby, a tiny bundle she called Hope, as if he might snatch her away. "We didn't take anything," Lena stammered, her words tumbling out in a rushed, desperate stream. "I swear, the door was open. I just needed a place for her to be warm, just for a few hours. The shelters were full and the wind. I couldn't let her get sick. Nico looked past her, at the pathetic collection of their worldly possessions in a single plastic grocery bag on the floor mat. A spare diaper, a half-empty bottle of water, a worn baby blanket. He had single bottles of scotch in his penthouse that cost more than everything this woman owned. The sheer injustice of it settled in his chest like a block of ice. He had spent his life chasing power and money, believing they were the answer to everything. And here was a mother and child whose entire world could be changed by something as simple as a warm room. He slowly knelt down, a difficult feat for a man his size, bringing himself closer to her level. He didn't want to loom over her. He wanted her to see his eyes. "What is your name?" he asked gently. "Lena." "Lena," he repeated, testing the name. "And the baby?" "Hope," she whispered, her gaze dropping to her child's sleeping face. "Hope," Nico said, and the word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. "Lena, I'm not the police. You're not in trouble. I give you my word." He paused, letting the weight of his next statement settle. "When I make a promise, God himself couldn't break it. You and Hope are safe now. No one is going to hurt you anymore." He saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Not belief, not yet, but a desperate wish to believe. He stood up and turned, walking back towards the Mercedes where Dmitri waited, his form a silent silhouette against the headlights. Nico's mind was working again, but the calculations were different. They weren't about violence and retribution. They were about logistics, shelter, food, security, protection. "Get me a location," Nico said to Dmitri, his voice low but firm. "One of the corporate apartments, the one on the west side near the hospital. I want it stocked. Food, clothes, everything a mother and a newborn could possibly need. Formula, diapers, blankets, a crib. Everything. Have a team there in an hour. And get Dr. Abramov on the phone. I want him to meet us there. The baby needs to be checked out." Dmitri didn't question the string of orders. He simply nodded, pulling out his phone and beginning the cascade of calls that would mobilize Nico's vast resources. The same network that could make a man disappear could just as easily create a sanctuary. Nico walked back to the Rolls-Royce. Lena was still huddled in the back seat, watching him with wary eyes. "We're going to go somewhere warm, Lena," he said. "Somewhere safe. I'm going to take care of you and Hope. You have my word." He opened the rear door on the other side and slid in, settling into the plush leather seat opposite her. He was careful to keep his distance, to make himself seem as non-threatening as possible. He hit a button on the console, and the car's advanced climate control system raised the temperature, bathing the interior in a soft, warm air. He dimmed the interior lights to a gentle glow. Where are you taking us?" she asked, her voice trembling. "To a home," Nico said simply. "It's yours for as long as you need it." He watched her as Dmitri got behind the wheel of the Cullinan and started the engine. The powerful V12 engine purred to life with a sound so quiet it was barely a whisper. As the car pulled smoothly out of the derelict alley, leaving the cold and the darkness behind, Nico saw a single tear trace a path down Lena's dusty cheek. It wasn't a tear of fear anymore. It was a tear of exhaustion, of relief, of a fragile, flickering thing he had almost forgotten existed. Hope. The corporate apartment was a two-bedroom suite on the 20th floor, with sweeping views of the city Lena had just been sleeping on the streets of. By the time they arrived, it was a hive of quiet activity. A team of Dmitri's most trusted men, professional and discreet, had already been there. The refrigerator and pantry were fully stocked. The master bedroom had a brand new crib assembled next to the bed. The closets were filled with new clothes for both Lena and the baby, the tags still on them. Dr. Abramov, a man whose silence Nico had purchased many times in his former life to patch up gunshot wounds with no questions asked, was waiting. He was a gentle, elderly man who owed his entire practice to Nico's patronage. He examined baby Hope with a soft touch, declaring her underweight, but miraculously healthy. He gave Lena a checkup as well, treating her for dehydration and exhaustion. Throughout it all, Nico stood by, a silent, watchful guardian. He saw the way Lena's eyes darted around the apartment, unable to comprehend the sudden, jarring shift in her reality. A few hours ago, she was trying to stay warm in a stolen car. Now she was in a luxury apartment with a private doctor and a pantry full of food. After the doctor left, Lena finally spoke. She was holding Hope, who was now awake and quietly looking around. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Why are you doing this?" Nico looked at the baby in her arms, and the answer was simple, yet impossible to fully explain. "I had a daughter once," he said, his voice thick with a pain that 7 years had not managed to dull. "Her name was Anya. She was 6 when I lost her." He didn't say more. He didn't need to. The grief was a tangible thing in his voice, an ocean of loss that Lena, as a new mother, could instinctively understand. No child should ever be cold. No child should ever be without a safe place to sleep. That's all. He pulled out a key card and placed it on the kitchen counter. "This is your home now, Lena. There's a bank card here with enough money for anything you could possibly need. Dimitri's number is programmed into the phone. If you need anything at all, you call him. He will handle it. No one will bother you here. You are under my protection." He turned to leave, feeling like an intruder in the sanctuary he had just created. "Wait," Lena called out. He stopped at the door. "I never knew your name." He hesitated for a moment. The name Nico Volkov still carried weight in the city. It inspired fear. He didn't want her to be afraid. "My name is Nico," he said. And for the first time, he left the ghost behind. As he walked down the silent, carpeted hallway, he felt a profound sense of purpose he hadn't felt since Anya was alive. It wasn't the adrenaline of a power play or the satisfaction of a business deal. It was something cleaner, something better. He had all the money and power in the world, but it had taken a homeless woman and her baby, sleeping in the back of his stolen car, to show him what it was truly for. He was halfway to the elevator when it opened, and 2 men in suits stepped out. They were detectives. Nico recognized the older one instantly. Detective Miller, a relic from the old days, a man who had spent a decade trying to put Nico behind bars, and who had come closer than anyone. "Volkov," Miller said, his eyes taking in Nico's expensive coat and impassive face. There was no surprise in his voice, only a weary resignation. "Heard you got your wheels back? Funny, no police report was ever filed. But a Rolls-Royce with a military-grade tracker tends to ping on a few watch lists when it goes missing. We tracked it to the docks, then here." Miller's gaze drifted towards the door of the apartment Nico had just left. "My guys said they saw you come up here with a woman and a child. Anything you want to tell me, Nico?" Nico stood his ground, his presence filling the hallway. He wasn't a criminal anymore, but he knew how this looked. "It was a misunderstanding, Detective," Nico said, his tone even and calm. "I found my car. The person who took it was a desperate mother trying to keep her child warm. There will be no charges pressed. The matter is resolved." Miller raised an eyebrow. Just like that. The Niko Volkov I remember would have resolved this a different way. A way that usually involved a trip to the bottom of the river for the person who disrespected him. That man is gone, Detective. You should know that better than anyone, Niko replied. I've been out of the life for 7 years. People don't change that much, Miller countered, though there was a lack of conviction in his voice. He was studying Niko, really looking at him. What's your interest in this woman? My interest, Niko said, his voice dropping, taking on a hard edge of absolute authority, is ensuring a mother and her child have a safe place to sleep. They are under my care now, which means they are off limits. To you, to anyone. Am I making myself clear? Miller held his gaze for a long moment. He saw something in Niko's eyes he hadn't seen before. It wasn't the cold emptiness of a killer. It was a fierce, protective fire, a righteous anger. Miller had a family. He had grandkids. He understood that language. He finally gave a short, sharp nod. All right, Volkov. We'll mark it down as a false alarm. Car recovered? No harm, no foul. He turned to his partner. Let's go. There's nothing for us here. As the elevator doors closed, Miller gave Niko one last look, a mixture of suspicion and grudging respect. Niko had won again, but this time he hadn't used fear or violence. He had used his power to protect, and in doing so, had disarmed the law itself. If this story proves that the strongest people are the ones who stand up for those who can't, hit subscribe and share it with everyone you know. Because Lena didn't run to the police. She ran to a man who looked like the very danger she was fleeing. And that man moved heaven and earth to save her. This single act became a catalyst. It wasn't enough to just help one mother and one child. The city was full of Lenas and Hopes, invisible people falling through the cracks of a system that had failed them. Niko had the resources, the infrastructure, and the will to do something on a scale that mattered. Within a month, he had liquidated $50 million of his assets and established a new organization, the Anya's Light Foundation. Its mission was simple and absolute: to provide immediate, no questions asked shelter and support for homeless mothers and their children. He converted one of his commercial properties, a former luxury hotel he had acquired, into a state-of-the-art facility. It wasn't a shelter. It was a sanctuary. Each family had their own private suite, fully furnished and stocked. There was on-site medical care, child care, job training, and legal aid. He tasked Dmitri with overseeing the foundation's logistics. The same trucks and supply chains that once moved illicit goods across the country were now used to deliver food, clothing, and medical supplies to families in need. The same network of contacts that once enforced his rule now found job placements and secured permanent housing. Niko Volkov had weaponized his entire former empire for the purpose of good. He poured his immense fortune and his formidable focus into it, building it with the same ruthless efficiency he had used to build his criminal enterprise. The ghost was back, but this time, he was hunting despair. 2 years passed. The Anya's Light Foundation became a beacon in the city. It had provided shelter to over 5,000 mothers and children. Its success rate for transitioning families into permanent housing and stable employment was an unprecedented 92%. Niko never put his name on it publicly. It was always just the foundation. But those who needed to know, knew. The city's underbelly, the new players, and the old remnants understood that the women and children at the foundation were under the personal protection of the ghost. They were untouchable. Niko visited the facility often. He knew the names of the children. He listened to the stories of the mothers. He found a quiet purpose in the hum of the place, in the sound of children laughing in the daycare center. One afternoon, he was in the on-site library, watching a little girl with bright, curious eyes toddle between the bookshelves. She was 2 years old, healthy and happy. Her mother approached, a smile on her face. It was Lena. The hollowed-out fear in her eyes was long gone, replaced by a calm confidence. She was now the facility's head intake coordinator, the first person new families met when they arrived. She used her own experience to offer them comfort and hope. "She loves the picture books," Lena said, watching her daughter, Hope. "Thank you, Nico, for everything." "Don't thank me," he said, his voice soft. "You did the hard work. I just opened a door." Hope wobbled over to him, holding up a picture book. She looked up at the giant, tattooed man without a trace of fear. She'd only ever known him as the kind man who brought her presents and always had a gentle smile for her. She reached out and placed her small hand on his, her tiny fingers barely wrapping around his thumb. Nico looked down at her hand, and then at the tattoos on his own knuckles. Iron. Will. He had thought those words meant power, control, dominance. But looking at this child, safe and thriving because of a choice he had made in a dark alley 2 years ago, he finally understood their true meaning. It was the iron will to protect, the iron will to do good, the iron will to keep a promise. Later that evening, Nico was back in his penthouse, looking out at the same city skyline. On his desk was a small, silver-framed photo of his daughter, Anya. She was smiling, a gap in her teeth, her eyes full of the light he had named his foundation after. He picked up the frame, his thumb gently tracing the outline of her face. For 7 years, this photo had been a source of unbearable pain, a constant reminder of his greatest failure. But tonight, it felt different. It felt like a mission. He hadn't been able to save his own child. But now, in her name, he was saving thousands. The pain was still there, a permanent part of his soul. But it was no longer just a wound. It was a fuel. It was a fire that burned away the darkness of his past and lit a path forward. He was still the ghost, but he no longer haunted the living. He haunted the shadows where children were cold and mothers were afraid. He was their guardian, their unseen protector. If this story reminded you that our deepest pain can be forged into our greatest purpose, subscribe, share, and comment below. Because somewhere right now, a child is looking for someone strong enough to help. Nico Volkov looked from the picture of the daughter he lost to the city full of children he could still save. He was not a good man. He knew that. The sins of his past were too many, the blood on his hands too deep to ever wash away. But he could be a necessary man. He could be a shield. His promise was absolute. His will was iron, and his work was just beginning.